مردم شریف ایران. من شهریار افشار هستم، میزبان شما در politics365.com. یک برنامه آموزشی، بی‌طرف و غیر انتفاعی. هر هفته ما با دو شخصیت فعال سیاسی، حقوق بشر و کارشناس مصاحبه می‌کنیم که صدای مردم ایران را در این جنبش ملی زنده نگردند. اگر مایل هستین از این برنامه حمایت کنین، خوشحال میشیم به وبسایت ما مراجعه بفرمایید در politics365.com و هر مقداری که تمایل دارین کمک کنید. با سپاس و با امید ایران آزاد بریم دنبال برنامه امروز. درود به مردم شریف ایران. من شهریار افشار هستم، میزبان شما در برنامه Politics 365. امروز یک مهمان خیلی فعال به برنامه دعوت کردیم، پروفسور جک گولدستون از جورج میسون یونیورسیتی در واشنگتن دی سی. ایشون یه کارشناس امور دولتی و پابلیک پالیسی در جورج میسون هستن و چند تا کتاب در زمینه انقلاب نوشتن که به نظر من خیلی جالب بود برای گفتگویی که ما همه ایرانی‌ها سراسر دنیا درش فعالیت میکنن. واقعا در تحت چه شرایطی یه انقلاب ممکنه به موفقیت برسه و تحت چه شرایطی ممکنه یه انقلاب شکست بخوره. خلاصه میخواستم از دکتر دعوت کنم که بیان به برنامه ما پیوستن و بقیه برنامه رو به انگلیسی تهیه کردیم، اما تا اونجایی که میتونم سعی میکنم یه جنبنده کوچیکی به فارسی هم آخر برنامه بکنم. Professor Jack Goldstone, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time. Such an interesting, as they say, we live in interesting times. Difficult times for a lot of people, especially with events going on in Gaza and Israel. Horrific events that we're witnessing. As I say in many programs, I really didn't want to live to see such horrors happening in the Middle East. Nothing would make Middle Easterners more happy than to see peace in their homelands, especially a lot of folks like in the diaspora in the Iran and American community, to enjoy the freedoms that we enjoyed in this country. We want to see that joy of freedom, especially government lack of, or really having the government oppressors move on and let the people enjoy the freedoms that we like to enjoy in this country. So with that kind of a concept, I really wanted to kind of pick your brain a little bit about your book and research about revolutions and rebellion and how you see events unfolding, and of course the experience of other revolutions, the Arab Spring, all those things that happen in the Middle East. We're witnessing something in Iran as affected by all the different events in the Middle East now, and we're just wondering, how do you see that process unfolding? If you could briefly give us a quick background about yourself and your role at George Mason, and then we'll get into rebellion.
All right. Well, thank you for having me, Shahryar. I'm a lifelong academic, researcher on democracy, development, and particularly revolutions. And I've been at this for longer than I want to say, but let's say I have decades of experience in examining the comparative history of revolutions and understanding social change around the world, including a fair bit of attention to Iran.
You know, that's fantastic. One thing I recall hearing from other people in the diaspora is that they said Iranians have only been ruled either by a monarchy or a dictatorship. They don't have any, other than in the 50s, they don't have any recollection of what democracy feels like. So, and especially the democratic ideology of tolerating different points of view. That is a different thing than Iranians are really familiar with. So I guess the question is, how do you feel, you know, there's been various rebellions in Iran over the past 44 years, all crushed, all, you know, lots of loss of life, horrific events that Iranians had to endure and watch. And now we're in the midst of another movement. And I'm just wondering, how do you assess this movement, good or bad? If there were a student in your class, what grade would you give this movement, and what can we learn from it?
Well, by this movement, I'm not quite sure what you mean, because there were the protests within Iran. There's the kind of broad coalition of Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah against Israel. So by this movement, which one do you mean?
I mean the Iranian people and their quest for freedom, their internal rebellion, if I can. They're calling it rebellion, revolution. But
right. Well, that, as I've said in a number of forums, I admire the heroism of protesters in Iran, but victory will not be coming anytime soon. Unfortunately for the movement, the government in Iran is pretty well entrenched. The military remains strongly supportive of the mullah's regime. The regime is forging ties with Russia and China to create pathways for its exports and gain foreign currency. And the leaders of the government have their fingers in enough of the Iranian economy that they're able to kind of dominate the distribution of resources. This leaves a lot of people more impoverished than they should be, but also allows the government to dole out favors and distribute goods as it feels needed to keep the loyalty of key segments of the population. Now, you started out this session by saying people want peace. And that is true, but I think you have to add what people really want is a just peace, a peace that they think is fair and protects the values that they are concerned about. And what's disturbing to a lot of people across the Middle East is they feel even during peacetime, they're not living in a just peace, whether it's people in Iran who feel that the regime is excessively oppressive, whether of women or of secular interests, whether it's the Palestinians who feel they live under oppression, or the Jews in Israel who feel the world is not sympathetic to the constant threat and the danger that they face. And so with everyone feeling that they're not living under a just regime, there are going to be efforts to try and change the status quo. And those often can be cataclysmic because they disturb everybody's peace, they raise anxieties, and lead to exacerbated conflicts.
Thank you for that clarification. A just peace. I think I will have to remember that because, you know, you could say people were at peace under Saddam Hussein. There was social order, but they were under an oppressive regime and dictator, and unless you spoke up. So given your research and you know, I'm curious, you know, give us a history lesson. What types of rebellion or are successful? I mean, what circumstance in other countries throughout history, what types of revolution make it?
Well, all different types of revolutions make it. Historically, we've had violent revolutions led by guerrilla forces. We've had nonviolent revolutions led by street protests. We've had street protests that turn into violent party regimes. It's not so much the type of movement that matters as the condition of the government that they oppose. What we can say with some consistency across history is that revolutions overturn governments that have already worn out their welcome, that are no longer inspiring much loyalty, no longer have a broad sense of legitimacy or support, and have started to lose the financial tools to orchestrate alliances and strength. So if you have a government that is financially stressed, either excessive debts or inflation or unable to meet its obligations, if that government is seen as no longer defending the honor and strength of the country, but becoming a danger to it, if it starts to lose the loyalty and support of key bureaucratic, religious, or military elites, then popular uprisings can draw elites into rebellion and create the kind of cross-class coalition that will topple a regime. But it takes those multiple elements.
Right. And as you explained, and everyone knows, the regime has its hands and fingers or grip on every aspect of Iran's economy. It makes sure to take care of its internal elites, however undeserving they are. And so that grip is really hard to break by just peaceful street protests and Iranian women, you know, burning their hijabs, you know. So from here to there is a long way to go.
It is. And the regime has been rather intelligent about trying to avoid making itself unpopular, as it were. It's presided over elections that were allowed to produce a variety of outcomes. It continues to be energetic, at the very least, in its propaganda and its effort to sway people's minds. And much of the dirty work that it does for repression, it does under cover of darkness or behind closed doors, all of which makes its position stronger.
Right. And, this reminds me, someone once told me about the American presidency, the number one priority of a first-term president is a second term. Yeah. And the number one priority of the Islamic regime is maintaining its position. It dabbles in regional instability throughout this 44-year history, but ultimately it wants to maintain its control over the economic cash flow that it's created for its elite.
Yeah,
not necessarily.
I think the real time of vulnerability may come when the supreme leader, Khamenei, passes away. It remains to be seen whether he will have secured a succession as strong as his own. He does not have the same kind of mystical power that Ayatollah Khomeini had to anoint a successor. And if there's a kind of unquestioned acceptance of his successor, that will strengthen the regime. But if there's some kind of struggle for position among different leaders contending to either be his replacement or to change the structure of government, that might create an opening for street protests to ignite bigger changes.
Right. And that was, I think, the first hope when Khomeini passed away. People said, okay, great. The mysticism is over and now there's going to be time change. But Khamenei stepped into it without too much of a blip. And now we're in the same position, 44 years into it. The regime has had 44 years to entrench itself in every aspect of society, even more. So now the question is, if he passes away, will his son or some other underling seamlessly step into power or be accepted by the Guardian Council and the committee, or will there be a gap, a power vacuum for someone?
The biggest risk is if Khamenei chooses a successor who is not widely supported. If he chooses someone who's seen as, well, that's a personal favorite, but this person really is not experienced enough or distinguished enough or capable of rallying the people enough, then we would see an interesting kind of challenge, much as when Hosni Mubarak seemed to be planning to install his son, Gamal Mubarak, as his successor. The military did not like that and essentially used the popular protests to block that outcome. So unless the successor for Khamenei has the full support of the military, we could see something similar.
And really, that's the operative support, the military, because no one has popular support in the people. It's more the oppressive organization, the oppressive organs of the state that will have to accept the successor, whoever that person is. But I guess the question is, at what point, I can just imagine sometimes that the power elite meet behind closed doors and they're having some tea and they're wondering how to divvy up the country if something like that happens. We're not having a unique conversation. It's been discussed many times in closed doors. Just curious to say, well, if I don't make my 500 million this weekend, that's it. I'm gonna. The reason I'm setting that conversation up is if popular demand, pushes the elite into a corner. The question is, these are Iranians, even though we don't like to admit it. Sometimes Iranians in the diaspora think of the regime as invaders from another planet or another country.
Well, that's not accurate, as you know.
I know. But this is how internally they look at it. That these are not Iranians, but because they've given up all of their Iranianness by virtue of their betrayal of our values and our oppression of our people.
You realize they would say the same thing about the diaspora.
Oh, I know. This is the dilemma. This is our quagmire that we're in. We both think of ourselves as invaders and traitors to the cause, the diaspora and the. So my question is, hypothetical question, and this has been discussed in the diaspora. Would a transition give a back door to these people to leave? we've talked about Venezuela and escape, take all their money and go. Would that be a situation that could practically exist?
I think what we would see is most of the elite would remain in Iran with their money, but switch their allegiance to a new figurehead who they felt would satisfy the people.
Right.
You
right.
might have some individuals leave if they felt they personally had become too unpopular or their situation was too risky. But I think most of the elite have kind of straddled the line between posing as Iranian nationalists and working closely with an oppressive regime.
Right.
And so if they get tarred with one, they'll kind of shift to the, I'm an Iranian nationalist, I help protect the country, wave that flag and try to survive.
Right. And we saw some indication of that propensity with Khatami and Rafsanjani, who said, hey, we're moderates, we're trying to, we are with the people, and that was very short-lived.
Right.
A lot of people were very excited about Khatami, not excited, but tolerant of some form of change. Dialogue of Civilizations, it was called, right? It was smiling. Remember that? I mean, that just seems like a distant memory now. He was at the UN, he was smiling, he was shaking hands. He wasn't like as divisive Ahmadinejad and denying of the Holocaust. He was people could tolerate him.
Yes.
But the regime quickly suppressed any kind of change he wanted to do, and he was pushed away, and Rafsanjani, same thing. So it's really difficult to find a situation where the elite would be able to give that opening. And the reason is the people may not tolerate, even if they change their colors, as politicians would do. The diaspora and the people of Iran are so had it with their regime that they may not give a back door to these people to just change colors and stay in Iran.
We'll have to see. I don't. It's so hard to predict whether change will come and when. Right. And it's even more difficult to say exactly who will be left standing when it occurs.
Right. No, a terrible question. I don't mean to put you on the spot. But, in a couple of minutes, in the minute we have left, with Hamas and Hezbollah and all the things that are going on in Gaza and Israel, how do you see Iran pulling the strings with Hamas and Hezbollah? It seems like, to me, their number one priority, like I said, is the second term, is to stay in power. Right. They don't really want to poke the bear and get into an open conflict with the US and Israel.
They don't want to poke the bear, but the worst nightmare of Iran's leadership would be for Israel, the United States, and Saudi Arabia to all come together in an event to contain, cut off, or undermine Iran's ability to function. They see all three countries as enemies, and if the three of them cooperate against Iran, they know they are in trouble. So Iran has done everything to try and put that off. One is to build ties with Russia and China as backup, but the other strategy, which has been quite effective, is to find proxies around the Middle East that can keep their opponents off balance. So they've backed the Houthi in Yemen, they've supported Hezbollah in Lebanon, they've supported Hamas in Palestine. All of this has managed to divide Israel, put distance between Israel and the US, and now with the latest move by Hamas, that seems to really undermine what was a coming rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So Iran has succeeded, I think, in the short term, in making the potential coalition of its worst enemies less likely.
Isn't that amazing? That you could look, not you, but that we could look at the events unfolding in the past few weeks, and somehow the regime would count it as a success because it's created division, which is always what it wanted, to divide and keep its opponents not united against and focus on Iran. Professor Jack Goldstone, thank you so much. This has been so illuminating. I feel like I was in your class for a few minutes. I don't know what grade I got, but
you're always welcome.
Thank you so much. I hope you can come back and join us soon. There's so much to talk about Iran and the Middle East and rebellion. Unfortunately, there's so much to talk about, and we really hope that our guests, our audience, really learn something from your talk. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.